I am Ted Zablotsky. I'm a book with the Simsbury Human Library. The title of my book is I'm a Child of World War II Resistance Fighters. What that means is that during World War II, my parents lived in Belarus, and the Germans invaded, and their lives changed forever. These are the stories of how they survived that time and how I came to be here in the United States. So Belarus is a country between Lithuania, Poland, and Russia. My parents were from that area. It's about 100 kilometers from Vilna in Lithuania. The town my mom was from was called Lida, L-I-D-A. My dad from a small village outside. They were married right before the war started, like in 1939. In 1941, the Germans firebombed the town and then sent troops in. The first night, they rounded up all of the Jewish leaders and killed them. And over the next few weeks, all the rest of the Jews in town and from surrounding areas were put into a ghetto. For those who don't know, a ghetto is a walled-off area. It's like a city that becomes a prison. No in, no out, guards and fences all the way around it. My dad was probably around 20, my mother about 18, and he was a big, strong guy. And his job in the ghetto was to walk around every morning with a wagon and a barrel and a shovel to clean up the people that had been killed overnight and left in the streets. Sometimes those were people he knew. Once it was a young cousin of his who was a baby, and that child had been killed in a very brutal way. So that's what his life was like. His mother was in the ghetto. My mother's parents and her brother were also in the ghetto. My father's mother passed away, that winter from malnutrition. My dad had been on his own really since he was 11 because his father passed away. And he had been in various businesses and had a lot of connections and spoke several languages and knew that there was no future in the ghetto. This was not going to end well for anyone. So he and my mom escaped the ghetto and went into the woods, very dense forests in that area. And they met up with other people who were like-minded. And they began the resistance, which was they wanted to live and they wanted to fight the Nazis any way they could. And that went on for a while. Because of my dad's connections, he heard that the Nazis were planning on what they called an action, which was they were going to liquidate the ghetto. So my dad snuck back into the ghetto to talk to my mom's parents and say, this is going to happen in the next week or two. Let me get you to escape the ghetto and come with us into the woods. My grandfather was one of those people who believed, unfortunately, that if you just keep your head down and do what they tell you, that nothing bad will happen, despite all the brutality that they saw on a daily basis in the ghetto, which I still can't fathom, but I can't judge. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, the Germans marched 6,500 plus people out of the ghetto, outside of town to where 2 large pits had been dug, and they made everyone disrobe, put their clothes in like piles, shoes with shoes, shirts with shirts, and they had all those people stand there naked, waiting for their turn to be killed and dropped into the pit. Getting my head around those numbers is difficult. You look at the World Trade Center where 3,000 people were killed in one day. This is twice as many, intentionally. And that kind of thing happened all the time in that part of the world. over and over again. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed that way, aside from those that died in concentration and extermination camps. I can only try and imagine what went through my grandfather's head while he was standing there with his wife and his 14-year-old son waiting for their turn. But that's how that chapter ended and the next one started for my parents in the woods. So in the woods, life was very different and very challenging, especially in the winter. In that part of the world, winters are severe. What they did was, and they got together with, there were hundreds of people that were in the woods at the same time. In fact, there was a movie a few years ago called Defiance with Daniel Craig in the star, and he played a character named Tuvia Bielski, and it was called the Bielski Partisans. I knew him. He was at my bar mitzvah. The people that they were in the woods with became my extended family because I had no grandparents, uncles, aunts, or cousins. And those people that survived with my parents were the ones that we associated with more. Winters were very severe. They would dig trenches and cover them with pine boughs and start little fires and crowd as many people as they could into these little shelters, if you would, to try and stay warm, which was a real challenge. One time my dad told me about a time when it was always more comfortable to sleep outside, actually. And he had a fur coat that he had obtained somehow. And he said one night he woke up and there was snow over him. There were like 2 feet of snow on top of him. And he was so warm because the snow on top of the fur was like an insulation. So they survived any way they could. They hunted in the forest. They went to surrounding areas. There were some very kind and generous people that would share their minimal amounts of food with them. Some would not willingly and were forced to because getting weapons was a very difficult thing for them, but they did. They would attack a small German patrol and they would take their weapons and then they went from there and they would attack bigger patrols and they got weapons. Eventually they would attack trains and outposts, and they resisted any way they could. And eventually the Germans started sending patrols into the woods to try and stop these partisan activities. They never really met with much success. One time there was a huge invasion of the Germans into the forest with tanks and so forth, and everyone had to escape. One of the advantages that the partisans had is their familiarity with these woods. They had grown up there. They had hunted there. It was part of their lives. It was their backyard. So they knew where to run. One of the occasions when they had to run, a rifle was more important to them than a person was. They had all kinds of people there. There were hundreds. At the end of the war, there were still 1,200 alive that survived because of, because of their activities. And my mom was not a tall person, and she had to cross a river holding a rifle above her head, and the water level of the river was just under her nose, and she thought she was going to drown, but she couldn't let that rifle get wet because that would have meant her life. So when I was a kid, my mom never went into a pool. At the ocean, she would never go in above her waist, and I never really understood why until it was explained to me. And then about 30 years ago, my brother and I went back with my dad to Belarus, and my dad was like, here's the river where your mom almost drowned. And here's this man's barn One of the food missions that my mom went to with my dad's cousin, it's just a lane with it was a village that had houses on one side of the lane and the barns and the pastures on the other side, just a row of homes. And someone came and knocked on the door and said, the Germans are on the other end of the lane. This was a man who my parents knew before the war and had been very generous during the war. And he took my mom and my dad's cousin and he put them in the barn across the way, which famously had a blue door. And he locked a chain around the handles and put a padlock on it. And then the Germans came to his door and said, we heard there were 2 Jewish women. We're looking in everywhere, open your barn. So they went over to the barn. He said, look, there's a chain and a lock on it. There's no way they could get inside. And that saved my mom. And he literally risked his life in order to do that. We went back and stayed at his house, actually, when we went to visit. No running water, it's peasant life there. And it was really an incredible experience. I never wanted to go to Poland for several reasons. One, I didn't have any family there, relations that I knew of. Two, you could say whatever you want about the Nazis, but they weren't stupid. And they were very methodical and planned things. And I always felt that the reason they put the death camps in Poland was because the Polish people were renowned anti-Semites and wouldn't object to it. It turns out that I was wrong about half of that. They did put the extermination camps in Poland for a reason, but it wasn't because they would be accepted. It was because that's where the Jews were. There were 3.5 million Jews in Poland before the war, and it was more economical for them to bring Jews from other countries and kill them in Poland than it was to have extermination camps somewhere else. Was there anti-Semitism in Poland before the war? Yeah. Is there anti-Semitism now? Yeah. Is it to the degree that it is in Western Europe? Not even close. Why are there 3.5 million Jews in Poland? Because they were welcomed there. After the Spanish Inquisition, the king said, come, be here, be a regular person. All rights. Everything that made life so good for Jews in Poland was because they were accepted. And they had freedom and they had rights. Yeah, there were people who attacked them, but that's everywhere in the world throughout our history. There was no especially bad treatment of Jews in Poland. And now I find there's a rebirth of Judaism in Poland, which is so stimulating for me because there were 2 chances for the Jews to be wiped out in Poland. Right after the war, the Soviet Union took over Poland, and religion was not a big thing for them. Everyone was Russian. Religion was not, a good thing. So people who were Jewish didn't act out on their Jewishness, if you will. They assimilated very quickly. Jews during the war would hide their children with Poles to raise them as non-Jews to save their lives. And only some of them found out after their foster parents were near death that they were really Jewish. But they didn't know what that meant. It's just a word. Again, in the 60s, the Soviet Union backed the Arabs during the Six-Day War. Until that point, when they lost, Jews were left alone. But now they said, no, we don't want any Jews living here. So there wasn't an expulsion of Jews, but if there were 2 Jews married to each other, all of a sudden they had no apartment and they didn't have a job. If a Jew was married to a non-Jew, they were left alone. So the Jews that left really were forced out. But the Jews that remained, again, they didn't know what that meant to be Jewish. And now the next generation in the last 5 or 10 years are discovering, my grandmother was Jewish. What does that mean? Like, what does being Jewish mean? Now that Poland is free, they can explore that. So there are organizations now that are points of entry for these new Jews, if you will. And it's really exciting. And we were over there in Krakow. It's remarkable, the vibrancy of that community. And are they religious practicing Jews? No, but they're just struggling to find their identity, which is more than they had 10 years ago. And it's really invigorating to be there and to see and experience what a growing Jewish community is like, with not overt anti-Semitism like you have in Western Europe. It's really remarkable. So I got a tremendous opportunity to be a book at the Human Library because of my affiliation with an organization called Voices of Hope, which was established by children of Holocaust survivors. The main focus is not to keep these stories, as interesting as they might be, alive or to spread these news to everyone else. The purpose of the organization is to send the message that what happened to our people was an attempt at genocide. The Nazis wanted to wipe out all Jews because they were Jews. They didn't feel that they were human. When a Jew would go into the concentration camp, they were stripped of their identity and given a number. That dehumanizes them. Not just the way they were treated, but why they were treated that way is because they were less than. They were not human, even though they looked like people, and therefore they needed to be exterminated. Genocide is a lesson that is not learned by this world we live in today. Genocide is bad, and humanity hasn't learned that lesson. And unfortunately, genocide is still going on in today's world. We need to speak out against it. So we go and we speak to middle school and high school kids and tell them the story in a brief way to show them the dangers of genocide, to show them the dangers of thinking that they are superior or inferior to anyone else. And when they see it, they should stand up and protest it. They should bring it to people's attention. Genocide is bad. Stop it. That's the message.